Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, to begin with, this is what's known as a neko cat. Now, fun fact, neko is technically speaking Japanese for cat. So when people say neko cat, they're saying cat cat. This is actually kind of one of those interesting things where, again, the English are sort of answer to these little phrases essentially are just repetitions. For example, chai tea. Chai is literally Hindi for tea, so when people say I prefer drinking chai tea, they're literally saying I like to drink tea. In which case, the second grader inside of my mind immediately begins to chuckle, but I'm going to move past it because it's a cheap, easy joke. But why am I showing you this? Well, this was a gift to me from a friend of mine who actually visited Japan several years ago, and she brought back a bunch of swag for everybody in the graphic novel book club that meets up at Ground Zero that I'm a part of. We all got to pick our stuff, and honestly, at the time, I was married to my ex-wife. She loved cats. I was like, you know what? I'll get her a little neko cat. Well, she's gone. She left the cat, and now it's mine, and I still have this little thing because I really enjoy it, because look at that little face. She's so cute. But I just also like the charm of it. What does this have to do with comics? Well, technically nothing right off the bat. But before I talk about comics, it's important to bring up this little cat because I have to ask a question. If I place it, say, underneath my desk like that, is it still real? To which case the answer is, yeah, dude, like, duh, of course it's real. Just because it moves off camera or goes underneath something doesn't mean it doesn't exist anymore. You know this because this is a concept of what is known as object permanence. Now, this is just one of these concepts that you're probably aware of even if you don't know that word or even if you couldn't really clearly define it. But at the most basic level, it's just an understanding or a faith or a trust that something exists even though you can't see it. For instance, I've never been to the Isle of Lesbos in Greece, but I know it exists because I've seen pictures of it on maps. I've seen actual pictures of it on the internet. I've read about it when I've been reading books about Greek history and culture. So even if I've never encountered the Isle of Lesbos, I trust that Lesbos exists. Again, even though you can't see the cat, you still know and trust that it actually exists. So that when I reach under my desk and pick it back up again, we can be... Okay, it's Socrates now. But we can still trust that Socrates will exist if I put him under my desk again. So, what does this have to do with comics? Well, this is where we now come back full circle because... Actually, I'm going to set you right up here, buddy. There we go. We're getting back to understanding comics. I know it's been a while and I've done a bunch of different videos, but again, I'm constantly reading graphic novels and comics, and so it's just whenever I can get to it. But I finished 3 chapters, so hopefully the next few videos will be back to back to back to back. But then again, I did just finish a couple of Green Lantern books, and I still need to do Batman White Knight. And you know what? We'll figure it out. The point is today's topic is Chapter 3. Make sure I'm getting the right chapter. Yes, Chapter 3, aka Blood in the Gutter, of Understanding Comics. And Chapter 3 starts off with a basic illustration of Scott McCloud as a child, and he tells a story about when he was a kid. He wasn't really sure if the world existed whenever he stopped looking at it. I don't know about you, but I definitely experienced this as a kid, and this is something most of us deal with as we're growing up. We have to have our perceptions of reality reinforced. Now, immediately, people who binge watch Philosophy Tube will immediately go, well, can we really be sure that it exists? To which case the answer is no, okay? But go watch Philosophy Tube, because that channel's fucking great. Excuse me. That channel's great, okay? And I'll post a link to the in the description section below. It's fun. But for the purposes of today's study, or today's video, the world exists, or at least we're going to believe empirically that it exists, because I can touch Doomslayer, he exists. I can touch Socrates, he exists. But again, what does this really have to do with comics? That in-between moment, when I placed Neko Cat under the desk, and it came back, or really Socrates came back. The point is that at that moment, you didn't see what was happening, but you trusted at that moment, or you created in your mind the existence of the cat. Well, again, when we're talking about comics, we have this unique structure. And I've done this over and over and over again, but I'm just going to keep pointing it out because it works. We have this gentleman here with a top hat, and then this gentleman here taking his top hat off to say hello. We don't see him remove the hat. All we see is this little white space, the gutter. And the gutter is absolutely everything because, as Scott McCloud points out, the gutter brings out this concept of closure. And closure is really, really, really important when talking about how comics work and how they operate. All right, now, this is going to drive me nuts. Hold on. Okay, Socrates exists. I can hold him. I can touch him. Place him under the desk. Wait 5 seconds. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi. Okay, Socrates will be there. I trust that he will be there. All right, now I pull him. Okay, now he's Quagmire from Family Guy. I know it's real. At least I think I do. Back to comics. All right, so Scott McCloud in Chapter 3 really observes the structural pattern of the gutter. Because again, when you're talking about a medium, you have to understand what are the tools and structures of it. And as Scott McCloud points out, closure, or the gutter, is really where comics works. Now, if you don't know what closure is, it's kind of a real feeling of reality. So you've probably had you've probably heard the word in relation to breakups. Your boyfriend or your girlfriend cheats on you, you have arguments, or even you just break up out of the blue, but you have some kind of final conclusion where you state your piece. That's closure in more of a traditional sense. But if you strip away that aspect of it, at its core, closure is really just kind of recognizing or really coming to a comfortable feeling about what is real. Closure is really important in terms of our psychology because, as he demonstrates, our brains naturally will create closure whether we recognize it or not. We know exactly, or you probably get a feeling of what those quarters and what that wire is supposed to look like. Likewise, this is technically speaking 2 dots, a line, and a circle, but nevertheless, you still look at that image and create a human face. That's closure. It's oftentimes a feeling or a perception that what you know is real is real. And when we look again at the issue of comics, this gutter is effectively making closure. Because even if we don't see the man take his top hat off, we still feel that he has. And he uses a really good example on the next page with this little 2-panel spread. I'll go ahead and let you pause the video here for a second so you can read it. Okay, so we have in this scene a man being chased by this man who's carrying an axe saying, "Now you die." And then we see a city and we hear a scream. Scott McCloud uses this 2-panel structure to really emphasize the idea of closure. He says, "See that space between panels? That's what comic aficionados have named the gutter. And despite the unceremonious title, the gutter plays host to much of our magic and mystery that are the very heart of comics." Now he goes on later on to say, "Participation is a powerful force in any medium." That's my cat, Jones. He may meow a couple times. And actually, excuse me, I read the wrong quote here. "Every act committed to paper by its comics artist is aided and abetted by a silent accomplice, an equal partner in crime. I may have drawn an axe being raised in this example, but I'm not the one who let it drop or decided how hard the blow or who screamed or why. That, dear reader, was your special crime, each of you committing it in your own style." And I'll let you see the panel where he briefly lays that out. And that at first may seem like a cop-out, but if you really stop and assess it, he's absolutely right. We didn't see the axe land into the victim. All we saw was a cityscape and a scream. We created the murder inside of our minds. You knew exactly where the axe landed. You knew how deep it went. You know how many times the axe went into the victim. But at the same time, can we really know it just using only 2 panels? This is the fun thing and also the problem with closure, because how do we know this isn't a film set? The man holding the axe might be just an actor. After that "ee-ah," we might see a director go, "cut," and then it goes back to the scene. Or for all we know, the man who's being chased by the axe-wielding maniac is the one who actually destroyed that man's life. There's so many options we don't have because we only have 2 panels. Nevertheless, this little strip is where all of our imagination comes to pass. And this is how comics works. Again, I've shown that image of the man taking the top hat off and off and off and on and on and on again. Words, what are they? But it's really vital that we understand that when we're approaching comics, those juxtaposed images in a deliberate sequence matter because they'll ultimately determine how we perceive them. Again, putting Quagmire underneath my desk, putting the Neko cat, putting Socrates, putting that thing underneath my desk, I know and trust that in that space and intervals, it's going to stay the same. But is it? And this is something that's really valuable when we look at the medium and how it's operating, because whether you're making comics or whether you're reading comics, you yourself are putting, or all the burden of the imagination falls upon you in that one single space. And the structure of that space, or the structure of the images on either side of that space, are absolutely everything. Because the next several pages, McCloud puts out the structure of the panels. He's going to keep meowing, so give me just 2 seconds. All right, I opened the window, so hopefully he'll just roam around there. He might start meowing again. If he does, I might just open the door for him. Anyway, when we're looking at panels, the images arranged on either side of the gutter are absolutely everything. And Scott McCloud is really, really smart in this book because he sets up 6 different panel structures. And that may not immediately make sense to you, but hopefully it will. So I'm going to go ahead, just hold up the book like this, go ahead and pause the screen for a second and read it if you want to, or just pause and look at the panels. Okay, I'm going to wait. You got it? Okay. So these are the first 4 panel structures. Again, he cites the first one is moment to moment. This is something it's probably easy to understand, whether it's just a woman blinking, a slow pan out from a planet, or watching the spider slowly move up. We see the gutter at this moment allows very small movements so that we can understand the time is happening. So moment-to-moment scenes are pretty standard, pretty easy to process. Action-to-action is also probably something most people are able to understand because this is where you'll get a lot of comic dynamics. So the baseball player hitting the ball, the man drinking his martini and then belching, must not have been a very good martini, and then this car slamming into a tree. Action-to-action is you're not going to see every last small detail, but you are definitely going to understand that some kind of action has taken place. The third one, subject to subject, is where you get a little more trickier, because at that moment we're not seeing the axe come down, we're just assuming that it comes down based upon the clues we get. Likewise here we see the couple having a conversation about, gosh, what an awful day. Well, at least Larry didn't call, and then of course the phone rings. You don't know that it's Larry because you haven't seen that shot. You haven't seen a moment-by-moment lead up to that, but you still trust it. You still know that it happens because that's the framework. And then right here, the last one, scene to scene. Now, this is something that's still probably familiar with most people because scene to scene is something that can take place in other mediums as well. It's a visual clue of, this one, the top one I'll just use right there, He Can't Escape Us Forever, 10 years later. So at this moment, these 2 images don't seem to have a lot in common. Nevertheless, we still trust and understand and know that they're connected because they still share some kind of visual or symbolic or just general similarity. So a subject to, or a scene to scene can create wider distances in time or can just help the artist as they attempt to just move forward through their comic. Now, the more 5 and 6, I'll go ahead and pause real quick so you can read this. Let me back out. All right. Go ahead. Pause the screen. You got it? Okay. So when you're looking at aspect to aspect, again, what we're looking at here is not so much a single moment by moment. We're not watching somebody slowly lift their hat and take it off. We're not even having like an action to action where holding the hat, taking it off. Now we're looking at something a little more broad and vague. So an image of the sun, an image of the desert, and then maybe an image of a man crawling through it. This aspect to aspect is really more of a world-building exercise, and so sometimes you will see aspect to aspects in comics. It ultimately just determines on what kind of graphic novel it is. This last one's a little trickier to understand, but if you read number 6, you'll see, and this page here also gives a pretty good example of it, This is one that is more or less seemingly random. Non sequitur basically just means kind of like a bunch of random images. So you could have a toaster popping up, then you could see soldiers fighting in Vietnam, and then on the next one you could see a light bulb popping up. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of coherent structure in those three images, so why would they be connected together? To which case the question is, I don't know, but for whatever reason, the artist has decided to arrange those sequences that way. Now, these are the 6 styles of those are the 6 panel structures, and he's showing you those 6 structures to really show how the gutter can operate, because it can help us move forward little bits at a time, or it can help us jump forward in time, or it can help create an atmosphere, or it can create a moment, what have you. And so naturally, because it's me, I got a big old stack of comics here to talk a little bit and show you some more examples of how this is operating. So if you ever read Bloom by Kevin Panetta and Savannah Ganusho, I'm positive that I butchered that name and I apologize. This is a small graphic novel about 2 young men. One of them is the children of a pair of bakers, and this young man joins up with the bakery. This is a nice little moment where we get an action-to-action sequence, because you can see him making sourdough bread, and it's just him cutting the dough, folding it, moving it. We don't see a great or dramatic shift in time. This isn't about building an atmosphere. This is more about watching somebody perform a physical action. Bloom is predominantly filled with sequences like these. There are plenty of shots of atmospheres, what have you, but by and large, most of the strength of this book is in just watching these characters make food, make bread, and interact. Another interesting book that I would definitely recommend, and I guarantee you at some point I'm going to just have like 40 or 50 videos about this one, is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. This is a truly amazing graphic novel for the way it balances a lot of different structures. So for instance, during one passage in the book, she's talking about the events going on in which her father is going to be eventually have to see a psychiatrist. We see here a memory, a passage from her diary, another passage from her diary, and then these text balloons, or these text boxes, tend to be her narrating the events of her life, analyzing the events of her life. So we kind of have almost, not necessarily an aspect to aspect, and not necessarily even a scene to scene per se. I have difficulty trying to understand this one in terms of its relation to it, but nevertheless we perceive the time as moving forward. And then, of course, down here at the bottom, we see kind of an action-to-action sequence, because we see Allison waking up, grabbing some food, talking to her father. But there's honestly a much better example of a moment-to-moment comic book, or excuse me, a moment-to-moment scene in one of the final passages in the book when she and her dad talk about being gay, or at least being queer. You'll see here, we don't have a lot of dramatic action. There's not the usual blend of literary symbolism which dominates this book. It's literally just 2 characters in these tiny boxes talking, which may not seem terribly interesting from afar, but when you take to equation all that's led up to this point, this is probably one of the most dramatic sequences in the book. And by using a moment-to-moment sequence, Bechdel is able to create a far more dramatic effect on the reader. I won't be able to show this one because it's a pornographic comic book, but In Bed with David and Jonathan by Tom Boudin is a really interesting examination of the gutter and how it can work, because predominantly when you're talking about gay erotic comics, or even just erotic comics period, for the most part, you're going to be getting moment-to-moment, action-to-action style panels, because again, you're reading this to become aroused. You're reading this to get off. And so there's more of an emphasis on the visuals and the actions in which the characters are taking place. Now, another further example of action to action is Green Lantern number 50, Green Lantern Volume 1 by Jeff Johns. I recently just finished this book, and Green Lantern comic books, in fact, superhero comic books, period, are really good examples of action-to-action sequences, because especially with Green Lantern, you can see this moment where he forms the structure of the giant fist, and when he slams it against the wall, we get that big explosion, coupled by a really nice automatopoeia. Again, when you're talking about superhero comic books, you're talking about action. People are reading these books because they want to see big, powerful people just swinging punches and fighting monsters. And again, you'll see this book out and about because probably one of the best practitioners of action-to-action sequences is Jack Kirby. Like, you really can't do better than him. The only reason I'm not going to open this book up and show you pages is because it's really thick and really heavy, and my back would probably throw out trying to hold the book up for you. But even if you just read a Fantastic Four comic but with Jack Kirby, or if you read his run on Thor, you can see how much action-to-action sequences are kind of at the heart of Kirby's aesthetic. And on the note of action-to-action, I'll provide one more example here, and that's Herman Melville's Moby Dick, published out by Dark Horse. The final sequence of the book, spoiler alert, is that Captain Ahab gets killed by Moby Dick because a rope wraps around his neck. The rope is attached to a harpoon, which Ahab literally just shoved into the side of Moby Dick, and then, well, there you go. There's an interesting sequence near the very end of the book where we watch Moby Dick just plunging back into the bottom of the sea. And this book is entirely black and white. So we see Moby Dick slowly going down, and then behind him we get the image of him dragging Ahab down into the depths. Though we may not see every single moment-to-moment of Moby Dick pushing and propelling himself down through the water, we're still able to see by this sequence, by this panel structure, and again by the use of the gutter, that action is taking place. It's also an interesting moment here where, while we are mostly getting action to action, we're also getting a nice kind of like scene to scene feel as well, because we're kind of catching a feeling for the immensity of the ocean and the darkness that is swallowing up Ahab. Now, I don't really have any good examples of non sequitur because for the most part, there really aren't a lot of good ones out there, or at least there really aren't any in my personal library. Non sequiturs are really difficult because they're really designed, for the most part, to be random and wild, so you'll really only get them in independent comics. And even then, most of the independent comics that I've read, ranging from like Robert Crumb and Art Spiegelman, even the most wild, random images and sequences still seem to have some narrative focus to them. So you honestly won't get a lot of examples of non sequitur comics. But at the same time, there is something really interesting when we talk about comics. And now, of course, I'm going to immediately run out of it. Okay, number 5 is an aspect to aspect, and that's one that Western readers probably aren't that familiar with because, as he points out, it tends to be more development of Eastern-style comics. Now, when I say Eastern, I'm predominantly talking about Asian comics, usually manga. So you're talking about comics that were generated in, say, China, mostly Japan for the most part, because Japan's really the country that developed the style of manga. But you're talking about a more Asian-style comic, and one of the artists that he focuses on, if I can reach down and grab it real quick, is this man by Osamu Tezuka. This man is really, really, really important because he crafted a lot of really beautiful work in that time. He's the creator of the works of Blackjack, Astro Boy, and then also an interesting series called Buddha. Now, Scott McCloud focuses and provides a couple of examples in the book showing how, while he would often employ moment-to-moment comics, he was also really effective at using aspect-to-aspect comics. Here we see an example of the sun, and then down here we see a bunch of people in the sun. So at this moment, the reader isn't necessarily following a single character. You're just feeling the presence, that oppressive presence of the sun, and then seeing these feet and the shadows that are created by the lights from the sun. This isn't really contributing much to the plot, but it still gives you a sense of feeling, of being in a space. And this is something that you'll encounter a lot of in Eastern-style comics. For example, I mentioned a second ago, again, Osamu Tezuka wrote this book, Buddha. This is actually part 1 of a 6-volume series, which is more or less kind of, it's sort of, air quote, the life of Buddha. However, at the same time, it also tends to be kind of like this weird adventure comics. It's simply amazing. I'm probably going to have to cover this at some point. But again, as he pointed out, Tezuka is really interesting because he tends to employ, yes, action-to-action sequences, but then he'll also do lots of aspect-to-aspect, where we'll get an image of the sun on the surface of water, a tree with two figures by the sides of it. And this also spills over a little bit into this panel where we see a lot of action-to-action, moment-to-moment, and then this page of the sun breaking through the clouds over this castle. Again, this isn't building the plot, but when you're talking about an Asian-style comic book, for the most part, as Scott McCloud points out, Western readers are accustomed to getting from point A to point B, whereas sometimes the Eastern-style comics, it's more about just being in a space rather than getting to a space. And so another good example, I know I'm just buried underneath a mountain of comics here, but if you ever get a chance, I would definitely recommend Lone Wolf and Cub. This book is simply phenomenal because while it does have a lot of moment-to-moment sequences and action-to-action sequences, it's also regularly broken up by scene to scene or aspect to aspect. You'll get moments of a single forest or a house in the rain or just an image of a castle in fog. Again, these don't build the plot or move us forward, but it's not really trying to. Yes, we see forests, and then of course we see Lone Wolf slowly emerge from the fog with his child, but even then, we don't need this to really mean much of anything. We're just becoming aware of a space. And this is something that has slightly bled through in some Western comics. Again, for the most part, you mostly get, in terms of Western comics, a very action-oriented perspective, but that's just because the medium tends to be working in that capacity. Now, I've already said a lot so far in this video, and I realize I'm really pushing it in terms of time, so I'm really just going to focus on one last sequence in Chapter 3, and then I'll kind of do like my final so what. Hold on. Giggity. Okay. It'll be a cat. It will be a cat. Or Socrates. I know it. I know it. I know it. I know it. Okay. Here we go. All right. Aha. It's Don Quixote now. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Moving on. I'm done. I don't care anymore. So, Chapter 3 is mostly focused on the gutter and how the panels around it can sort of create different feelings within the reader. We can either watch solid physical action, we can move from feelings to feelings, random, incomprehensible, abstract, or concrete images that may not necessarily mean anything, or sometimes we can just watch scenes that can slowly develop and use the symbolism or just the image and clues in each of the comics to create a moment. But one of the also really important things about the gutter is not necessarily just that it's the space between the panels. We also have to consider, again, the way the panels are arranged on the page. So I'm going to go ahead, hold this page up, actually hold these two pages up, and let you read. Just pause the video for a second. Okay, you're back. Hopefully you noticed that he told 3 different stories. There's this story, which covers an entire page. There's this story, which covers this page, this part of the page, and then this story, which is all of 4 panels. But, nevertheless, all 3 stories employ the same character, they employ a lot of the same dialogue, and they employ some of the same panels. The only difference is some of those panels were cut out. So, by putting more panels into the sequence, and specifically putting in more gutters, you can potentially put less and less, I won't say burden, but maybe more responsibility upon your reader. I'm going to move Don Quixote right over here. Thank you, sir. And so you can observe here at this moment that what's really important is that regardless of whether or not you're a reader or a creator of comics, your gutter can mean absolutely everything. If you read just this one 4-panel comic book right here, you get a really short, and for the record, really sad but oddly funny story about a poor man who's told not to drink. He drinks, he gets in a car crash, and then he dies. It's a very short story and can become very almost allegorical if you want to go that route. But then likewise here with the full page story, we get some of the same panels, and so we will eventually get to that tragic car crash. But in that time, we get a lot more of the story. Now this is kind of where you get to the so what. The so what matters because those gutters are where the reader is making the story. We're watching this character move through space and time, and so creators can try to come up or try to figure for themselves is what effect do I want to have on the reader? Do I want them to have a short little strip of a man drinking in a car and crashing, or do I want to tell the whole story of a young man who just wanted to go out, hang out with his girl, watch a movie, what have you? The number of panels and the number of gutters will ultimately determine what is the aesthetic effect on the reader. And that's important because if you're telling a superhero story, you may not want your reader to get bogged down with sequence after sequence of a fist coming at them. Sorry, my phone's apparently going into lower power mode, so I'm probably going to have to pause this pretty quickly. But the point is that these panels can ultimately, the panel and the gutter will determine the aesthetic effect on the reader. If you're reading a book and you get just a couple of panels, you have to imagine all the information that's come in between. Whereas if you get all those panels, you don't have to work as hard for it. And so what Scott McCloud is trying to demonstrate here is that just because you have a small number of panels doesn't mean you have less of a story. All that matters is that you're creating a different aesthetic effect. What happens between those panels is absolutely everything. And even the arrangement of the panels themselves can have an effect upon the reader. Because depending on how the panels look, what the content of the panels, what have you, the gutter is where your reader is actually going to experience the story. So I'm going to pause it real quick, plug my phone in, and I'm going to finish this up, I promise. So I didn't get as much to say in that last little section as I really wanted to, but I don't really feel like there's that much more that really needs to be stated. Again, comics as a medium works through the gutter. Because, again, it's a medium in which we are arranging images in a deliberate sequence to create an effect upon the reader. So when approaching this medium, we have to try to understand what is the author trying to do, what is the author trying to say, what is the author trying to create in our experience, and then, again, as always, how exactly does the format and the structure contribute to that? One of the brilliant things about this book is that Scott McCloud uses just about every single sequence style, every single gutter style in this book, because he's constantly trying to create an aesthetic effect. If we go back to that sequence where he's showing the different styles of comic panels, of course, I'm going to just, here we go. If we look at this, again, we're mostly doing kind of like an aspect to aspect, or possibly even an action to action, or a moment to moment. This is difficult to say because it's a nonfiction book, and because we're also kind of dealing more with the abstract quality of thought and analysis, which is not always very fun to read. But nevertheless, we see these panels and the gutter structures are the key to everything, because it affects how we, the reader, encounter the work. So when we consider comics and comic studies, or even just reading comics, period, we really have to consider how much the gutter is doing. I'll give you an example, and of course it's been swallowed up by all these stacks of comic books. Oh well, I had a simple one I was going to do, but I guess I used Calvin and Hobbes, because it works. Some of my favorite Calvin and Hobbes comics are when he and Hobbes would hop on the wagon and then just roll down a hill talking about philosophy. But if you look at this one page here, we see, for the most part, this is a action-to-action sequence. We're not watching this wagon panel by panel by panel go down the hill, because for the most part, we're mostly using the actions to sort of build the scene of Calvin and Hobbes trying to basically push forward through time. They start off here at the top of the hill with the clock, and then by the end of it, they have moved forward in time, as far as Calvin says, as he says, well, it looks like Einstein is a fraud. No, he's right. Look, my watch isn't going at all anymore. It's a fun little play on the notion of physics and relativity. But nevertheless, we see at that moment, Bill Watterson was using the panel structure to make a joke. Again, that's typically the structure of most comic strips in the newspapers. But even then, using that action-to-action sequence, we went somewhere. We encountered something. Times changed. We trusted that when we moved from one panel, the same thing was going to happen in the next, or at least something very similar. Don Quixote is Don Quixote is Don Quixote, no matter how many times I put him under the desk. And no matter how many times I put him under the desk, I trust when I bring him back out, he's going to be Don Quixote. So, I think that's it. Thank you so much for watching, whoever you are, wherever you are. I really appreciate this. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I did a good job of explaining the gutter. I guarantee you I'm going to have to keep talking about that concept over and over. So moving forward, make sure you remember that key term. But anyway, yes, thank you for watching. As always, when it comes to understanding comics, I'll post a link to Scott McCloud's website in the description section below. I'll also post a link to PhilosophyTube because a friend of mine shared a video from that channel recently, and I've just become like low-key obsessed with that channel. So also, if you are the guy from that channel, hey, anyway. As always, too, if you're interested in understanding comics or any one of the 100,000 comic books that just litter the world around me, always feel free to pop into your local comic book shop, especially for something like Understanding Comics. I guarantee you they'll probably have a copy of it. If not, they can probably order it for you. And if your local comic book shop doesn't carry it, check out your local public library. Trust me, it really helps. Again, as always, thank you so much for watching this. I think you're so cool and so awesome. Go read some comics.